Emily had always been the epitome of stability. She was the kind of person who scheduled dentist appointments 6 months in advance and knew exactly where we'd spend Christmas before summer even ended. I admired her organization, her reliability. In a chaotic world, she was my constant, a pillar I leaned on without question. But somewhere along the line, that started to change. It wasn't dramatic at first. A late work dinner here, a last-minute client meeting there. She'd send a text around 6:30, apologizing for missing dinner, saying not to wait up. Then she'd stroll in hours later, her cheeks flushed and her perfume mingling with the faint scent of wine. "Clients," she'd explain casually, setting her bag down by the door. "These deals don't close themselves." I nodded, swallowing the slight unease that rose in my chest. It was Emily, after all. She wasn't the kind of person who kept secrets, or so I thought. The late nights became more frequent, and her explanations started to feel scripted. Her tone, once breezy and natural, now seemed overly rehearsed, like an actress playing the role of a busy professional. Still, I told myself not to read into it. Stress from work, I reasoned. Marketing was a cutthroat industry, and Emily had been vying for a promotion for months. One night, as I was clearing the dinner table, my phone buzzed with a message from her. "Stuck at work again. Don't wait up. Love you." The words were familiar, but something about them didn't sit right. "Love you" felt like an afterthought, more an obligation than genuine affection. I shrugged off the thought, chalking it up to my imagination. Emily was just tired, I told myself. We both were. But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The next day, I decided to surprise her at lunch. It wasn't something I usually did, but I thought it might brighten her day. I stopped by her favorite sushi spot, grabbed her usual order, and drove to her office building. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, and I held up the takeout bag. "I'm here to see Emily. Thought I'd surprise her with lunch." The receptionist's smile faltered. "Oh, Emily's not here," she said. "She's at a client meeting." My stomach twisted, but I forced a smile. "Right. Do you know when she'll be back?" "She didn't say," the receptionist replied with a shrug. "Sorry." I thanked her and left, the sushi bag suddenly feeling like dead weight in my hand. My mind raced with questions. Why hadn't she mentioned the meeting? And why did it feel like she was hiding something? That evening, Emily came home later than usual. She breezed through the door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and kissed me on the cheek. "Sorry I'm so late," she said, kicking off her shoes. "It was a madhouse at work." "How was the client meeting?" I asked casually, keeping my tone light. Her hand froze mid-reach for her purse. It was only for a second, but I noticed. "Oh, it was fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just the usual stuff." I nodded, biting back the questions swirling in my mind. Instead, I poured us both a glass of wine and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. But that night, as I watched her fall asleep beside me, her face serene and untroubled, I couldn't help but wonder, what was she keeping from me? A week later, I found the receipt. It was crumpled in the side pocket of her car, wedged between old receipts and a dried-out pen. The header caught my eye first, a fancy Italian restaurant halfway across town. Nowhere near her office. I smoothed out the paper, my eyes scanning the details. 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, dessert. The date matched one of her late work nights. My chest tightened. Who was she with? A client? A friend? Or someone else entirely? I decided not to confront her immediately. Instead, I started paying closer attention to her schedule, her stories, the subtle ways she avoided eye contact when I asked about her day. The inconsistencies piled up like pieces of a puzzle, each one pointing to a truth I wasn't ready to face. One evening, while Emily was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Normally, I wouldn't have touched it, but something compelled me. I picked it up, the screen lighting up with a message from someone named Jay. "Tonight was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My hands shook as I stared at the message. Tonight? Amazing? Who the hell was Jay, and what exactly had been amazing? I locked the phone and set it back on the nightstand, my mind spinning. The shower shut off, and I barely had time to compose myself before Emily walked into the room, a towel wrapped around her. She smiled at me, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. That night, I lay awake long after she'd fallen asleep. My thoughts raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was this all in my head? Or was there something darker at play, something I'd been too blind to see? The next day, I made a call. "Alex, it's me," I said, gripping the phone tightly. Alex was an old friend from college, a private investigator. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I needed his help. "Dan, long time no talk," he said. "What's going on?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. "It's Emily," I said finally. I think she's lying to me. About a lot of things." Alex's tone shifted immediately. "What do you need?" "Proof," I said. "I need to know the truth." He paused. "Are you sure you want to go down this road?" he asked. "Once you start digging, you can't unsee what you find." "I'm sure," I said, my voice firm. "I need to know." Alex didn't waste any time. By the next day, he'd set up surveillance. Discrete cameras, background checks, and tracking software. The kind of measures that made me feel like a stranger to myself. Was this who I'd become? The kind of husband who spied on his wife? But the gnawing doubt in my gut had left me no choice. "It's all standard," Alex said when he saw the hesitation in my eyes. "You're not doing anything wrong. You just want the truth." The word truth echoed in my mind, hollow and unsteady. I told myself that's what I wanted, but a darker part of me feared what we might find. The waiting was unbearable. Each night, Emily came home with her perfectly crafted smile and breezy excuses, her charm now tinged with something sinister. I found myself dissecting every word, every laugh, every glance. Were they sincere? Or were they part of the lie? The paranoia was suffocating. I began noticing small things I might have overlooked before. Her hesitation when I asked about her day, the way she checked her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, the faint trace of cologne that didn't belong to me. The doubts grew louder with each passing hour. I wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand answers. But I knew it wasn't the right time. Not yet. A week later, Alex called. His voice was grim, his words measured. "We need to meet," he said. "I think you're going to want to see this." My stomach twisted into a knot. "What is it?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. "Just meet me," he said. "It's better if I show you." We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Alex slid a manila folder across the table, his expression guarded. "Before you open that," he said, "you need to prepare yourself. This might not be what you were hoping for." "I just need the truth," I replied, though my hands were trembling as I reached for the folder. Inside were photos. Emily, sitting at a dimly lit table with a man I didn't recognize. The two of them were leaning toward each other, their faces lit with an intimacy that made my chest tighten. In one photo, she was laughing, her hand brushing against his as if no one else existed. And then there was the one that shattered me. Emily and the man standing in a parking lot, his arms wrapped around her waist as she tilted her head up to kiss him. I stared at the images, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of disbelief and fury. This wasn't a business dinner. This wasn't a client meeting. This was an affair. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex hesitated. "His name is Jason. He's a co-worker of hers." The revelation felt like a blow to the chest. A co-worker. Someone she saw every day. All those late nights, the vague excuses, the texts from Jay, it all clicked into place with devastating clarity. My mind reeled with questions. How long had this been going on? How many times had she lied to my face? How many nights had she come home to me with his scent on her skin? "What do you want to do?" Alex asked, his tone cautious. I closed the folder, my jaw tightening. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I can't ignore this." Alex nodded. "Whatever you decide, I've got your back," he said. "But take some time to process this. Don't do anything rash." That night, I sat in my car outside our house, staring at the warm glow of the living room window. Emily was inside, probably sipping wine and watching one of her favorite shows, completely unaware of what I now knew. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I debated my next move. Should I confront her? Pretend everything was fine? Or walk away and never look back? The weight of the decision pressed down on me like a stone. I finally got out of the car and walked inside. Emily looked up from the couch, her face lighting up with that same perfect smile that now felt like a cruel mockery. "Hey," she said. "You're home late." "Yeah," I replied, my voice tight. "Got caught up at work." She nodded, turning back to the TV as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The following days were torture. Every interaction with Emily felt like a performance, a charade I couldn't escape. Her routine hadn't changed. Late nights, vague stories, and that damn smile. But now, I couldn't unsee the photos, couldn't erase the image of her with Jason from my mind. It was like a splinter lodged in my thoughts, impossible to ignore. One evening, while Emily was out, I searched her things. It wasn't something I was proud of, but desperation had a way of eroding morality. In her purse, I found another receipt. This one was from a hotel downtown. The date matched one of her client meetings. My hands shook as I held the slip of paper, the implications striking me like a slap. When Emily came home that night, I was waiting for her. She walked through the door, her heels clicking against the floor, and froze when she saw me sitting at the dining table with the hotel receipt in front of me. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. Her face drained of color. For a moment, she looked like she might bolt, but then she forced a laugh, shaking her head. "It's a work expense," she said. "Why are you going through my things?" "Don't lie to me, Emily," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "I know." Her composure cracked, and she took a shaky step back. "Know what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "About Jason," I said. "About the dinners, the texts, the hotel. I know everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's mouth opened and closed as if searching for the right words. Finally, she sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Don't insult me," I snapped. "I've seen the photos. I know exactly what it is." Tears streamed down her face as she buried it in her hands. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I demanded, my anger rising. "You didn't mean to betray me? Didn't mean to lie to me for months? Which part was an accident, Emily?" Her sobs grew louder, but her silence said everything. I stood, my chest heaving with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "I don't know if I can do this," I said quietly. "I don't know if I can look at you and not see what you've done." "Ethan, please," she begged, reaching for me. "I love you. I never stopped loving you." I stepped back, her touch burning like fire. "You don't do this to someone you love," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't destroy their trust and expect everything to be okay." Her sobs echoed through the room as I turned and walked away, slamming the bedroom door behind me. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The house was a vacuum of silence the next morning. Emily had retreated to the guest room after our confrontation, leaving a chasm between us that felt unbridgeable. I hadn't slept much. My mind had replayed our argument on an endless loop. Her excuses, her tears, her confession. The more I tried to make sense of it, the less everything added up. When I finally went downstairs, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, and Emily was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug. She looked up when I entered, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. "Morning," she said softly, her voice fragile. I didn't reply. Instead, I went to the cabinet, grabbed a mug, and poured myself some coffee. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick with all the words we hadn't yet said. "Ethan," she began tentatively, her voice breaking the stillness. "We need to talk." I turned to face her, leaning against the counter. "Do we?" I asked coldly. "Because I think you've said enough." Her hands tightened around the mug, her knuckles turning white. "I know you're angry," she said, "and I don't blame you. But I need you to understand." "Understand what?" I snapped, my voice sharp. "That you betrayed me? That you lied to me for months? Please, Emily, enlighten me. What part of this am I supposed to understand?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she held my gaze. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said quietly. Jason, it started as work. Just work. And then what? I interrupted, my tone rising. You tripped and fell into his bed? Don't insult me with excuses, Emily. I've heard enough. She flinched as if I'd struck her, her composure crumbling. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said, her voice breaking. I never wanted this. But you wanted him, I said bitterly. Didn't you? Her silence was deafening, and the final piece of denial I'd been clinging to shattered. She hadn't just stumbled into an affair. She'd chosen it, over and over again. I set my coffee down, my hands trembling. I can't do this, I said. I can't look at you and pretend this didn't happen. I don't even know who you are anymore. Ethan, please, she begged, standing and reaching for me. Don't say that. I love you. I always have. Stop, I said sharply, stepping back. You don't get to say that. Not after everything you've done. The day passed in a blur. I couldn't stay in the house, so I got in the car and drove aimlessly through the city. The radio played softly in the background, though I barely heard it. My mind was too noisy, too full of memories and questions that refused to quiet. Every thought led back to the same question. How had we ended up here? Images of our life together flashed through my mind. Our wedding day, her radiant smile as she walked down the aisle. Our vacations, laughing as we navigated foreign streets. The quiet nights at home, tangled in each other's arms. Were those moments lies, too? Or had we just lost our way? By the time I returned home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the driveway. Emily's car was still in the driveway, but the house felt empty. I hesitated before going inside, bracing myself for whatever confrontation awaited. But when I stepped through the door, the quiet was almost unbearable. I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up when I entered, her face a mixture of exhaustion and sorrow. You were gone all day, she said softly. I needed space, I replied, my tone flat. She nodded, taking a sip of her wine. I get it. I do. I stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to demand answers to questions I wasn't even sure I wanted answered. But another part of me felt tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of the anger. Tired of the pain. Why, Emily? I asked finally, my voice breaking the silence. Why him? Why now? She set the glass down, her shoulders slumping as she stared at her hands. I don't know, she said after a long pause. At first it was just easy. He listened. He made me feel. Don't, I interrupted, my tone sharp. Don't tell me he made you feel something I couldn't. Don't insult me like that. I'm not trying to insult you, she said, her voice rising with desperation. I'm trying to explain. Do you have any idea how lonely I've felt? How distant we've been? I wasn't looking for this, Ethan. It just happened. Don't say it just happened, I snapped. That's the coward's excuse. You made a choice, Emily. Every time you went to him, you made a choice. Her tears spilled over, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. I know, she choked out. I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you. And I hate myself for it. But I never stopped loving you, Ethan. I swear to God, I never stopped. I stared at her, my chest aching with a mix of anger and sadness. You don't do this to someone you love, I said quietly. You don't lie to them, betray them, and then expect them to forgive you. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she said, looking up at me, her face streaked with tears. I'm asking for a chance to fix this, to fix us. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I considered them. Could we fix this? Was there even a way to come back from something like this? The anger in my chest burned bright, but beneath it was a flicker of something else, doubt. Was I ready to throw away everything we'd built? Or was there still something worth saving? I don't know, I said finally, my voice raw. I don't know if I can do this, Emily. I don't know if I can trust you again. She nodded, her tears falling silently. I understand, she said, but I'm not giving up. Not on you. Not on us. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken words and emotions too tangled to unravel. For the first time, I saw the weight of her regret, the depth of her sorrow. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I'm staying in the guest room, I said, my voice cold but firm. I need time to figure out what I want. Emily nodded, her face crumpling as she wiped at her tears. Take all the time you need, she whispered. As I walked away, her sobs echoed behind me, a painful reminder of the love we'd lost and the battle that lay ahead. The days that followed were marked by a strained silence that neither of us seemed willing to break. Emily tiptoed around me, her efforts at reconciliation subtle but constant. She left little notes on the counter, apologies scribbled in shaky handwriting, and went out of her way to maintain a facade of normalcy. But the weight of her betrayal hung in the air, a presence neither of us could ignore. I spent most of my time in the guest room, surrounded by boxes of old memories I'd yet to unpack. Photographs of happier times stared back at me from their frames, taunting me with what we'd once had. I wanted to feel anger, to let it consume me and burn away the pain. But all I felt was exhaustion. One evening, as I sat on the edge of the bed scrolling mindlessly through my phone, a message from Alex popped up. Found something new. Call me. My heart sank. I hadn't expected Alex to keep digging, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him to stop. Part of me hoped he'd find something, anything, that would make sense of the chaos Emily had brought into my life. I hesitated for a moment before dialing his number. Alex, I said when he picked up. What's going on? I've been keeping an eye on Jason, he said, his tone careful. And I think you'll want to hear this. An hour later, I was sitting in Alex's office, a stack of files and photographs spread out before me. He pointed to a photo of Jason leaving a restaurant, his arm around a woman who wasn't Emily. Turns out your wife wasn't the only one he was seeing, Alex said. He's been playing this game with more than one person. I stared at the photo, a strange mix of relief and anger bubbling in my chest. So he's just, what? Some serial cheater? Pretty much, Alex said. From what I've gathered, he's done this to at least 3 other women. Your wife just happened to be one of them. The revelation didn't make Emily's betrayal hurt any less, but it shifted something inside me. Jason wasn't some grand romantic figure sweeping her off her feet. He was a liar and a manipulator, and she'd fallen for it. That night, I returned home with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. Emily was in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, but she turned toward me when I walked in. Hey, she said softly, her voice tentative. How was your day? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I set my bag down and sat across from her. We need to talk, I said. Her face paled, and she nodded. Okay. I know about Jason, I said bluntly. I know he's been seeing other women. Her eyes widened, and she leaned forward. What? How do you? It doesn't matter how I know, I interrupted. What matters is that you need to understand who he really is. He's not some savior, Emily. He's not the answer to your problems. He's just a guy who preys on women and moves on when he gets bored. She sat back, her hands trembling in her lap. I didn't know, she whispered. I thought he cared about me. He didn't, I said firmly. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can start figuring out what you really want. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't argue. I was stupid, she said, her voice cracking. I let myself believe he was something he wasn't. And I hurt you because of it. You didn't just hurt me, I said, my voice cold. You destroyed us, Emily. And I don't know if that's something we can come back from. She broke down, her sobs filling the room. For a moment, I considered going to her, offering some form of comfort. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. The days that followed were a blur of tense conversations and awkward silences. Emily tried to explain herself, to convince me that she was committed to rebuilding what we'd lost. But her words felt hollow, weighed down by the enormity of her betrayal. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my own life. I started working longer hours, throwing myself into projects that distracted me from the mess at home. I reconnected with old friends, filling my evenings with dinners and drinks that reminded me of who I was before Emily's lies consumed me. One evening, as I was heading out the door, Emily stopped me. Ethan, she said, her voice trembling. Can we talk? I'm late, I said curtly, not meeting her eyes. Please, she pleaded, stepping in front of me. I need you to hear me out. I sighed, setting my keys down on the counter. Fine, I said. What is it? She hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. I know I've said this before, but I need you to believe me when I say I'm sorry. I know I've broken your trust, and I know it's going to take time to fix it, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Her words were desperate, but there was a sincerity in her eyes that gave me pause. For the first time, I saw the depth of her regret, not just for what she'd done, but for the pain she'd caused. I don't know if it's enough, I said after a long silence. I don't know if anything can be enough. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she said, her voice breaking. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be better, that we can be better. Her words lingered in my mind long after I left the house. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope that we could somehow rebuild what we'd lost. But another part of me couldn't shake the image of her with Jason, the lies she'd told, and the life we'd shared slipping through my fingers. By the time I returned home that night, Emily was asleep on the couch, a blanket pulled tightly around her. I stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, and felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Love? Loss? Regret? Maybe all of it. I didn't wake her. Instead, I went to the guest room, where the memories of our life together still surrounded me. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized that the road ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that healing, whether together or apart, might still be possible. The air in the house was heavy with unspoken words. Emily's regret was palpable, but so was my resentment. Every interaction between us felt like a delicate dance, each step measured to avoid triggering the landmines of anger and heartbreak that threatened to explode. But even as we tiptoed around each other, I could feel the tension building, an inevitable breaking point looming just ahead. I spent most nights in the guest room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone or staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My thoughts were a tangled web of memories, questions, and doubts. Could we really rebuild what we'd lost? Or were we just delaying the inevitable? One evening, as I sat at the dining table eating a cold dinner alone, Emily walked in, her face pale and her hands clenched tightly around a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the table in front of me, her movements shaky. "What's this?" I asked, my tone wary. "It's a letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "From Jason." I froze, my fork hovering in midair. "Why do you have a letter from him?" "He sent it to my work," she said, tears pooling in her eyes. "I didn't know what to do with it, so I brought it home." I stared at the folded paper, the urge to open it warring with the dread of what I might find inside. "What does it say?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't read it. I thought you should." My hands trembled as I picked up the letter and unfolded it. Jason's handwriting was neat and deliberate, each word carefully chosen. "Emily, I know I hurt you, and for that, I'm sorry. You deserved better than what I gave you. You deserved honesty, respect, and love. I can't change what's happened, but I want you to know that I wish things had been different. I hope you find happiness, whether it's with Ethan or on your own." The letter ended abruptly, without the grand declarations of love or apologies I'd expected. It was subdued, almost resigned, and for some reason, that made it sting even more. I set the paper down, my appetite gone. "What do you want me to do with this?" I asked, my voice cold. "I thought you'd want to know," Emily said, her tears spilling over. "I thought it might help." "Help?" I said, my anger flaring. "How exactly is this supposed to help, Emily? All it does is remind me of what you did, what he did." She flinched, her shoulders sagging under the weight of my words. "I don't know," she whispered. I don't know what else to do." I pushed the letter aside and stood, my chair scraping against the floor. "If you're looking for some kind of absolution, you're not going to find it here," I said, my voice hard. "Not from me." That night, I found myself driving aimlessly through the city, the letter still fresh in my mind. Jason's words echoed in my head, not because they absolved him, but because they made me question everything. Had Emily fallen for him because he offered something I hadn't? Or was it simply a matter of circumstance, a fleeting connection that had spiraled out of control? By the time I returned home, the house was dark. Emily was in bed, the sound of her soft, uneven breathing drifting down the hallway. I stood outside her door for a moment, my hand hovering over the knob, but I couldn't bring myself to go in. Instead, I retreated to the guest room, the distance between us feeling insurmountable. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a text from Alex. "We need to meet. There's more you should know." My chest tightened as I read the message. I'd thought the investigation was over, that we'd uncovered everything there was to know. But the urgency in Alex's words suggested otherwise. I replied quickly, agreeing to meet him at a nearby diner. When I arrived, Alex was already seated, a folder in front of him. His expression was grim, and my stomach churned as I slid into the booth across from him. "What's going on?" I asked. He pushed the folder toward me. "It's about Jason," he said. "And Emily." I opened the folder, bracing myself for more photos, more evidence of their betrayal. But what I found was something else entirely. Emails, receipts, and documents that painted a picture far more complicated than I'd anticipated. Jason wasn't just seeing other women, Alex explained. He was manipulating them, Emily included. He used them for money, for connections, for whatever he could get. Your wife wasn't the first, and she won't be the last. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd spent so much time blaming Emily, so much energy hating her for what she'd done, that I hadn't considered the possibility that she'd been a victim, too. When I returned home, Emily was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and puffy. "Where were you?" she asked softly. "With Alex," I said, setting the folder down on the coffee table. "He found more on Jason." Her expression shifted, a mixture of fear and curiosity. "What did he find?" I sat beside her, opening the folder. "Jason's been doing this for years," I said. "Using women, manipulating them, and moving on when they're no longer useful to him." Emily's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought he cared about me." "He didn't," I said firmly. "He used you, just like he's used everyone else." Tears streamed down her face as she absorbed the truth. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she sobbed. "For everything. For hurting you. For being so blind." Her regret was genuine, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected, compassion. She'd made mistakes, terrible ones, but she wasn't the villain I'd made her out to be. She was human, flawed and broken, just like me. "I don't know where we go from here," I said quietly, "but I think we owe it to ourselves to figure it out." Emily nodded, her tears falling freely. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "Whatever you need." That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept in our bedroom. The divide between us was still there, but it didn't feel as insurmountable as before. We were two people trying to navigate the wreckage of our relationship, unsure of where the road would lead but willing to try. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The days that followed felt surreal, as if I were living someone else's life. Emily and I began to talk more. Not the superficial exchanges we'd fallen into over the years, but real conversations. Painful ones. She opened up about her loneliness, about the cracks in our marriage she hadn't known how to mend. And I, in turn, admitted my own failures, the distance I'd created, the moments I'd taken her for granted. It wasn't an excuse for what she'd done, but it was a start, a step toward understanding, if not forgiveness. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dining table, Emily reached for my hand. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling, "I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for, and I know you might never be able to forgive me, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt the weight of her regret. It wasn't just an apology, it was a plea. For closure, for a chance, for something I wasn't sure I could give. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." but I'm willing to try. Emily nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. That's all I can ask. We began therapy shortly after, a suggestion she'd made weeks earlier that I dismissed in my anger. Sitting in that small, sterile room with a stranger dissecting our marriage was uncomfortable, to say the least. But it forced us to confront the realities of our relationship, the good, the bad, and the painfully ugly. Through it all, I learned things about Emily I'd never known. Her fears, her insecurities, the ways she'd felt invisible even when I was right beside her. And she learned about my own struggles, the pressures I'd kept buried, the ways I'd retreated instead of reaching out. It was a slow process, and there were days when it felt like we were making progress, only to slide backward the next. But we kept going, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel something shift. The anger that had burned so brightly began to dim, replaced by something quieter. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginnings of acceptance, of what had happened, of who we were, of what we might still become. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Emily turned to me with a tentative smile. I was thinking, she said, maybe we could get away for a weekend, just the two of us. Her suggestion caught me off guard. The idea of spending time together, away from the safety of routine and therapy, felt daunting, but it also felt possible. Where would we go? I asked. Anywhere, she said, as long as we're together. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. Okay, let's do it. We chose a small cabin in the mountains, far from the noise and chaos of the city. The air was crisp and clean, the kind that made you feel like you could breathe deeply for the first time in ages. We spent the days hiking and the evenings sitting by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't perfect. The scars of what had happened were still there, and some wounds were too fresh to touch. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope, that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. As the months passed, life began to settle into something resembling normalcy. Emily and I continued therapy, working through the tangled mess of our relationship one thread at a time. We rebuilt trust slowly, piece by fragile piece, until it felt strong enough to hold us again. But it wasn't just our marriage that needed rebuilding. It was myself. I threw myself into work, not as a distraction, but as a way to reclaim the parts of me I'd lost. I reconnected with friends, pursued hobbies I'd abandoned, and allowed myself to dream of a future that didn't feel defined by betrayal. One day, as I was cleaning out the guest room, I came across the folder Alex had given me. The photos, the documents, the evidence of Emily's affair. They were all still there, untouched since the day I'd brought them home. I stared at them for a long moment, the memories they held flashing through my mind. And then, without a second thought, I threw them into the trash. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about letting go of the anger, the resentment, the weight of everything that had happened. Because while the pain would always be a part of me, it didn't have to define me. Years later, as I stood in the backyard of our home, watching Emily laugh with our friends at a barbecue, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. We weren't the same people we'd been when this journey began. And that was okay. We'd learned, we'd grown, and we'd found a way to move forward, together. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was ours.